Let's start with something reassuring. Nothing is exploding. No alarms are ringing. No dramatic music is playing in the background. In fact, if this story were a movie, this would be the part where nothing seems to be happening at all. Just people sitting in rooms, quiet rooms, clean rooms, rooms with chalkboards, coffee cups, and men who look like they haven't slept enough, but also haven't panicked yet. Which is comforting, because this is a story about how the world almost ended, and it almost ended in a very polite way. There were no villains laughing maniacally, no red buttons being slammed in slow motion, no last-second speeches about destiny. The end of the world, if it had happened, would have arrived wearing a tie, holding a pencil, and asking for permission first. That's kind of the problem. This is not a story about anger. It's not even really a story about hatred. It's a story about calm people, very calm people. People who believe deeply in logic, reason, and the soothing power of numbers behaving themselves. And that should already make you a little uneasy. Because historically, the most dangerous moments in human history are not the loud ones. They're the quiet ones. The moments when everyone agrees, when nobody is yelling, when the room is so calm that no one notices how close they are to the edge of something very stupid. This story begins after World War II, when humanity looked at what it had just done and thought, well, we should probably not do that again, or at least not by accident, which felt like progress. The war had ended, cities had been erased, and a new invention had entered the world. Not just the atomic bomb itself, but something more unsettling. The realization that the end of civilization no longer required a massive effort. It just required a decision, or even worse, a misunderstanding. For the first time, the end of the world was fast, it was efficient, it was almost elegant. And elegance, as it turns out, is very attractive to mathematicians. Now, to be clear, nobody woke up one morning and said, let's see if we can end humanity using algebra. This was all very well intentioned. People wanted safety, stability, a future where children could grow up without wondering if tomorrow would still exist. So they did what humans always do when they're scared and confused. They asked someone to calculate it. They brought in people who were very good at sitting quietly and thinking for long periods of time. People who believed that if you stared at a problem hard enough and long enough, it would eventually admit what it was doing wrong. Mathematicians, not the kind with rulers and homework sheets, the kind who enjoyed abstract ideas, the kind who saw the world as something that could be simplified, reduced, modelled, if not controlled, then at least understood. And there was something deeply comforting about that idea, that maybe, just maybe, the terrifying chaos of human conflict could be turned into something neat, something predictable, something that fit inside a framework. A few assumptions, a few variables, a few equations, nothing dangerous yet. At this point, no missiles are flying, no submarines are moving, no generals are sweating. Everyone still believes that mathematics is a safety feature. And why wouldn't they? Math had worked before. It built bridges that didn't fall down. It put rockets into space that mostly came back. It created machines that could compute faster than any human ever could. So surely it could help with war, or at least help prevent it. This is where the story gets strange. Not because anything dramatic happens, but because of how ordinary it all feels. Picture a quiet office somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. A desk, a chalkboard, a man explaining something with gentle confidence. He is not shouting. He is not emotional. He is explaining a model. He is explaining a model of human behavior. That alone should have raised some eyebrows. But it didn't, because models feel safe. Models don't yell. Models don't panic. Models don't launch missiles because they had a bad morning. Models just sit there patiently, waiting to be trusted. And trust them people did. What no one noticed at first is that something subtle had happened. War had stopped being something that happened between people. It had become something that happened between ideas. The battlefield moved from muddy fields and ruined cities to chalkboards and briefing rooms. Instead of asking how angry the enemy was, people started asking how rational they were, which is a very strange question to ask about humans. But again, nobody thought this was dangerous. If anything, it felt like progress. Less blood, more thinking, less shouting, more reasoning. Surely that had to be an improvement. and in a way it was. But it also meant that the fate of millions of people was now being discussed in sentences that began with phrases like, "Assume a rational actor." Assume. That word is doing a lot of work. This chapter is not about explosions or disasters. It's about the moment before them, the moment when everyone believes they are being careful, the moment when the system feels stable and reasonable and deeply convincing. Because the scariest thing about this story is not that the world almost ended, it's how calmly it almost happened. No one noticed because nothing felt wrong. Everything was logical. Everything made sense. Everyone agreed that the numbers were correct. And when numbers agree, humans tend to relax. So for now, relax too. Nothing bad is happening yet. The missiles are still in their silos. The equations are still just ideas. The end of the world is still theoretical. For the moment, it's just a quiet room. A piece of chalk, and a belief that math of all things would never betray us. After the war ended, everyone exhaled at the same time, not loudly, not joyfully, more like the tired exhale of someone who has been holding their breath for years and only just noticed their lungs hurt. World War II was over, but it left behind a strange silence. Cities were rebuilding, borders were being redrawn. People were promising very sincerely that this would never happen again, which is something humans say a lot, right before figuring out new and more creative ways to do the same thing. But something had changed. War was no longer just about soldiers and supplies. It wasn't even about territory anymore. It was about potential, about what could happen, about what might happen if someone made the wrong move or misunderstood a signal, or trusted the wrong assumption. And the thing about potential is that it lives very comfortably in people's heads. So war began to migrate, slowly, quietly, away from battlefields and into minds, into planning rooms, into classified documents, into thought experiments. This was the beginning of a new kind of conflict, one where the most important battles happened long before anything physical occurred, a war where the main question wasn't who would win, but whether anyone could survive the winning. The atomic bomb had changed the rules so completely that nobody really knew what the rules were anymore. Traditional strategy books suddenly felt outdated. Charging forward made no sense. Retreating made no sense either. Everything felt upside down, so people did what they always do when the rules stopped making sense. They invented new ones, or at least they tried. Governments began to realize that they needed a different kind of weapon. Not a bomb, not a missile, something quieter. Something that could tell them what would happen before it happened. They wanted certainty, and certainty is not something generals are known for providing. So they turned to people who specialized in certainty, or at least in pretending it exists. Mathematicians. These weren't men in uniforms. They didn't shout orders or march in formation. They wore slightly wrinkled suits. They spoke softly. They asked uncomfortable questions like, "What exactly do we mean by winning?" At first, their presence felt harmless, even comforting. After all, mathematics had an aura of objectivity. Numbers didn't lie. Equations didn't have opinions. If you could describe a problem mathematically, you could understand it. And if you could understand it, maybe you could control it. That was the hope. War planning began to look less like maps with arrows and more like diagrams, flowcharts, decision trees. If they do this, then we do that. If they escalate, we respond. If they hesitate, we wait. It all felt very reasonable and deeply surreal. Imagine explaining to someone 100 years earlier that the fate of nations would one day depend on people sitting around calmly debating hypothetical decisions made by imaginary enemies based on assumptions about how rational everyone was supposed to be. They would have laughed or cried, possibly both. But this was the new reality. The Cold War wasn't fought with bullets, at least not directly. It was fought with expectations, with models of behavior, with predictions about predictions. Everyone was trying to get inside everyone else's head, and then draw a diagram of it. This is where war officially became a thought experiment. Not a casual one, a very expensive one, a very serious one, but still, at its core, a giant intellectual puzzle where the prize for getting it wrong was the end of civilization. No pressure. Generals started asking mathematicians questions that would have sounded absurd just a decade earlier. Questions like, if we threaten this, will they believe us? Or, if we don't respond immediately, will they think we are weak? Or, what is the optimal response to an irrational opponent? That last one caused some quiet discomfort, because the models worked best when everyone behaved nicely, rationally, calmly, according to plan. Humans, as a group, have never been especially good at that, but the temptation was too strong to resist. If you could reduce war to a system, you could analyze it, optimize it, predict it, and prediction feels a lot like safety, even when it isn't. So the models grew more elaborate, more detailed, more confident. They had names. Now, strategies, doctrines, frameworks, words that sounded solid and reassuring, words that made it feel like someone was in control. And yet, beneath all of this careful thinking, there was a strange contradiction. The weapons were designed never to be used. Their entire purpose was to sit quietly and threaten existence by simply being there. This meant that war planning became an exercise in imagination. What would happen if? What would they think if? What would we do if they did something that we think they think we would do something about? At some point, nobody could remember who started which assumption, but the equations didn't care. They just accepted the inputs. This is also where something subtly dangerous began to happen. War stopped feeling emotional. It stopped feeling human. When decisions are filtered through models, they lose their texture. They become clean, abstract, bloodless. An arrow on a chart does not scream. And because nothing physical was happening yet, everything felt under control. The absence of disaster was taken as proof that the system worked, that the models were correct, that the thinking was sound, which is always a risky conclusion. Because when nothing happens, it's very hard to tell whether that's because your plan is brilliant or because you've just been lucky so far. Still, confidence grew. Mathematics had entered the war room, and it was speaking with quiet authority. People listened. People trusted it. People felt relieved that someone somewhere was doing the math. No one noticed that war had stopped being something that happened out there. It was happening on paper now, in minds, in assumptions. And once war becomes an idea, it can travel very fast. It doesn't need fuel, or soldiers, or even time. It just needs agreement. And for the moment, everyone agreed that this was the smartest way forward. The battlefield was gone. The chalkboard had replaced it. And war, for the first time, was being fought without anyone firing a shot, which felt like progress. It also felt like the calm before something very strange. But nothing was wrong yet. Everything still made sense. And that, as we will see, was exactly the problem. At some point, someone had a thought that seemed both obvious and brilliant. What if we treat war like a game? Not a fun game, no dice, no board, definitely no snacks, but a game in the sense that it has players, choices, rules, and outcomes. A situation where each side tries to guess what the other side will do, and then do something clever in response. This idea did not arrive with dramatic flair. It sort of drifted in, quietly, respectably, wearing glasses. The logic was simple. If humans are making decisions, then those decisions must follow some pattern. And if there is a pattern, then it can be studied. And if it can be studied, then surely it can be predicted. That word again, predicted. The dream was not to make war more exciting or more violent or more frequent. Quite the opposite. The dream was to make it boring, predictable, stable, a solved problem. Which sounds nice until you remember that the problem is war. This is where rational thinking entered the room and confidently took a seat at the table. Rational thinking, in this context, means something very specific. It does not mean kind. It does not mean wise. It does not even mean sensible. It means consistent. It means that when faced with choices, a person will always choose the option that best serves their own interests, based on the information they have. This sounds reasonable, almost flattering. Humans like to think of themselves as rational. It's one of our favourite myths. So mathematicians began to imagine simplified humans. Humans who were not tired, or angry, or confused. Humans who never acted out of spite, boredom, pride, or fear. Humans who did not misinterpret signals or take things personally. In other words, humans who did not exist. But for the sake of the model, this was fine. Models are not supposed to be realistic. They are supposed to be useful. And usefulness, in this case, meant clarity. So they created little stories, Not equations yet. Stories. Two players. Each has choices. Each choice leads to consequences. Each player wants to avoid the worst outcome, and ideally, secure the best one. If you do this, I do that. If you do that, I do this. It felt almost comforting, like a puzzle you could solve on a rainy afternoon, and this approach had a name, game theory, which is a slightly unfortunate name because it suggests fun, and there was absolutely none of that involved. Game theory was really about incentives, about understanding what motivates someone, and then predicting how those motivations would guide their behavior. It asked questions like, if you know your opponent is smart, and they know that you know they're smart, what happens next? At this point, things started getting a little abstract, but still manageable, still calm. The idea was that if both sides understood the structure of the game, they would naturally avoid the worst outcomes. Nobody wants mutual destruction. Nobody wants to lose everything. So rational players would steer away from disaster. This was the hope. But there was a catch. There is always a catch. Rationality works beautifully in small, controlled situations. A business negotiation, a card game, choosing which line at the grocery store will move faster. These are environments where mistakes are annoying, but not fatal. Nuclear war's not one of those environments. When you scale rational thinking up to the level of nations, something strange happens. The incentives become enormous, the stakes become infinite, and small miscalculations suddenly matter a lot, like end of the world a lot. Still, the models looked elegant. They produced clear results. They offered answers where there had previously been only dread and uncertainty. And answers are addictive, so rational thinking began to feel like a weapon, not one that destroys things directly, but one that promises control, a way to outthink the enemy, instead of outgunning them. This was deeply appealing to people who did not want to imagine actual explosions, but rational thinking has a dark side. It assumes that everyone is playing the same game, that everyone agrees on the rules, that everyone values the same outcomes, and that is a bold assumption to make about humans, especially humans who are scared. In these models, fear was just another variable, something you could quantify, something you could plug in and move around. The idea that fear might override logic entirely was often treated as an inconvenience rather than a central feature. After all, if fear breaks the model, that's a problem for the model, not for reality. Right. The strange thing is that none of this felt reckless at the time. It felt responsible, careful, thoughtful. People weren't trying to start wars, they were trying to prevent them. They believed that by understanding the logic of conflict, they could remove its unpredictability. And unpredictability was the enemy. So rational thinking spread. It became more formal, more respected, more deeply embedded in planning and strategy. It began to shape how leaders thought about deterrence, threats, and responses. War was no longer just about strength. It was about signaling, about convincing the other side that you were both capable and willing to do terrible things, but also perfectly sane, which is an interesting balance to strike. As this way of thinking became more dominant, something subtle shifted. Decisions were no longer judged by how they felt, or even by how they looked, but by whether they made sense within the model. If the model said an action was rational, then it was considered acceptable, even if it felt horrifying. This is how rationality, very quietly, became dangerous. Not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Because humans are not just decision-making machines. They are emotional, inconsistent, easily distracted creatures who sometimes do things simply because they are tired or annoyed or trying to prove a point, and none of that fits neatly into an equation. Still, for now, everything seemed under control. The models were working. The world had not ended. The logic felt sound. Rational thinking sat there calm and confident, like a weapon that promised never to fire. Nobody noticed that it was already loaded, and nobody asked the most important question. What happens when two perfectly rational systems misunderstand each other at the exact same time? We'll get to that. But first we need to meet someone who loved rationality very much. Someone who believed deeply in its power, someone whose mind moved faster than fear itself, because he was about to take this idea much, much further. If this story were a novel, this is where a very interesting character quietly walks into the room and immediately changes the temperature. John von Neumann did not look like someone who would reshape the logic of war. He was small, polite, and usually smiling. He dressed neatly. He enjoyed parties. He laughed easily. He had the relaxed manners of someone who never felt the need to prove how smart he was, which was convenient because everyone already knew. Von Neumann's mind was by most accounts ridiculous. Not impressive, not brilliant, ridiculous. He could read books as a child and recite them word for word years later. He could perform complex calculations in his head faster than most people could write them down. He once corrected someone's math while half listening and carrying on a separate conversation. This was not a brain that moved quickly. It moved effortlessly. And because of that, von Neumann was very comfortable with abstraction. Numbers were not intimidating to him. They were friendly, familiar, almost playful. He treated complex systems the way some people treat crossword puzzles, something to enjoy with a cup of coffee. So when war became an intellectual problem, von Neumann felt right at home. He had worked on the Manhattan Project. He understood exactly what nuclear weapons could do. He was not naive about destruction. He simply did not find it emotionally paralyzing. This is important. Many people, when faced with the idea of total annihilation, freeze. They recoil. They feel moral vertigo. Von Neumann did not. He approached it the way he approached everything else, calmly, analytically, with curiosity. Not because he was cruel, but because fear did not slow his thinking. In fact, fear seemed to bore him. Von Neumann believed deeply in the power of mathematics to describe reality, not just physical reality, but human behavior. He believed that if you could clearly define a system, you could understand how it would behave, and if you could understand it, you could anticipate its outcomes. This made him a natural fit for the emerging world of strategic planning. He was one of the early champions of applying game theory to real-world conflict. He saw war not as chaos, but as a structured interaction between rational agents, players with preferences, choices, payoffs. From his perspective, this was not cold or heartless. It was practical. If war was going to exist, and it clearly was, then it made sense to think about it as clearly as possible. Emotion only clouded judgment. Math, on the other hand, did not flinch. Von Neumann once argued that if a conflict was inevitable, then it might as well be handled decisively. He even suggested that preemptive action could sometimes be the most rational choice if it reduced long-term risk. This made people uncomfortable, not because his logic was sloppy, but because it was disturbingly consistent. He was not advocating violence for its own sake. He was following the logic to its conclusion, and that conclusion was sometimes unpleasant. This is where von Neumann's contradictions become interesting. He loved civilization. He enjoyed art, culture, conversation. He hosted lively gatherings. He laughed often. He was, by all accounts, charming. And yet he could discuss mass destruction as if it were a scheduling problem. Not casually, but calmly. For von Neumann, efficiency was not a moral category. It was a technical one. If a system could be optimized, it should be. Whether that system was a computer, an economy, or a war, this way of thinking was both powerful and dangerous. Powerful because it cut through confusion. Dangerous because it treated outcomes as variables rather than lived experiences. To him, the idea that war could be optimized was not horrifying. It was logical. If people were going to make decisions anyway, those decisions might as well be informed by clear reasoning rather than impulse. And he was very persuasive. When von Neumann spoke, people listened. Not because he was loud or domineering, but because his arguments were sharp and coherent. He made complex ideas feel obvious, like you had always known them, but just hadn't quite put them into words. This gave mathematical thinking enormous influence in military circles. Under his influence, strategies became more formal, more precise, more confident. War planning began to resemble engineering. You defined objectives, you analyzed constraints, you selected optimal solutions. The moral weight of these choices was often acknowledged but quietly set aside. Ethics, after all, were harder to quantify. Von Neumann was not blind to the risks of this approach. He understood that models were simplifications. He knew they left things out, but he believed that imperfect clarity was better than emotional chaos. And besides, someone had to do the thinking. What's important to understand is that von Neumann did not see himself as playing with fire. He believed the fire was already there. Math was just a way to map it. In his mind, refusing to think rationally about war did not make it go away. It just made it more dangerous. This attitude shaped the emerging doctrine of deterrence. The idea that peace could be maintained not through trust or goodwill, but through a careful balance of threats. A balance that could, in theory, be stabilized mathematically. Von Neumann believed that if both sides understood the logic of the situation, they would act accordingly. They would avoid the worst outcomes. They would behave predictably. This faith in rational behavior was central to his thinking. And this is where the seed of the problem was planted. Because von Neumann's models worked beautifully under one condition, that the players were rational, informed and consistent. That they understood the game the same way. That they valued survival above all else. He did not ignore the possibility of irrationality. He simply believed it could be managed. This confidence was not arrogance. It was the natural result of a mind that had rarely encountered limits. But war has a way of finding the limits of everything. Von Neumann's influence ensured that mathematics would sit at the heart of Cold War strategy, not as a suggestion but as a foundation. His ideas shaped how leaders thought about deterrence, escalation and stability. War was no longer a failure of diplomacy. It was a system to be controlled, and systems, if designed correctly, do not spiral out of control. At least that was the theory. As this way of thinking spread, it created a world where decisions about unimaginable destruction could be discussed calmly, politely, even optimistically. A world where the end of everything could be analysed without raising one's voice. John von Neumann did not create the Cold War. He did not invent nuclear weapons, but he helped give the age its intellectual language. A language of optimization, of equilibrium, of rational choice. And once that language existed, it was only a matter of time before someone asked the most unsettling question of all. If everyone is acting rationally, then what does winning even mean? That question is where things began to get very strange. By the time people started asking what winning actually meant, something important had already gone wrong. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, in the background, like a crack forming in a wall that everyone keeps walking past because the building still looks fine. Traditionally, war had a fairly simple definition of victory. You gained territory. You defeated the enemy's army. You forced a surrender. There were losses, of course, but there was also an afterward, a moment where the war ended and something else began. Nuclear weapons ruined that, because once those existed, the idea of winning became awkward. You could destroy your enemy, yes, completely, efficiently, with impressive speed, but you would also destroy yourself. Not always immediately, not always symmetrically, but inevitably. The damage didn't stop at borders. It didn't respect flags or uniforms. It spread. It lingered. It poisoned the future. So victory started to look suspiciously like failure. This created a very strange strategic environment. A world where the strongest move was often to do nothing, where the most powerful weapons were designed never to be used, where the goal of having overwhelming force was to make sure that force stayed perfectly still. Imagine building the most dangerous machine in history, and then congratulating yourself every day it doesn't turn on. That was the Cold War. The logic behind this was simple, at least on the surface. If both sides knew that using nuclear weapons would guarantee their own destruction, then neither side would ever use them. Mutual fear would keep the peace. Terror would become stability. This idea became known as mutual assured destruction, which is an impressively honest name. No euphemisms, no poetry, just a straightforward description of the plan. We will not attack you because if we do, you will attack us, and then everyone dies. Very comforting. And yet this logic was taken seriously, not emotionally, but intellectually. It was discussed in quiet rooms with charts and diagrams. It was analysed, refined, optimised. The assumption was that no rational actor would choose annihilation, and on paper that makes sense. If survival is your top priority, and nuclear war guarantees your destruction, then avoiding nuclear war becomes the most rational choice available. Simple, elegant, almost reassuring. The problem is that this logic depends on everyone believing it at all times, not just understanding it, believing it. Because deterrence is not about what you plan to do, it's about what the other side thinks you might do. And that introduces an uncomfortable level of psychological complexity. You have to convince your opponent that you are rational enough not to start a war, but also irrational enough to actually follow through on your threats if provoked. You must appear calm but also terrifying. This is a delicate balance. Too rational. And your threats seem empty. Why would you destroy yourself over a minor provocation? Too irrational. And you become unpredictable, which is even more dangerous. So nuclear strategy became a kind of performance, a carefully rehearsed act of controlled madness. Leaders spoke in measured tones about unacceptable losses. Military documents discussed scenarios where millions of people died as if they were budgeting errors. Everything was framed as necessary, regrettable, but logical, and again, because nothing was happening, it felt like it was working. The absence of catastrophe became evidence of success. The fact that the world had not ended yet was taken as proof that the strategy was sound. This is a common human mistake. We tend to judge systems by whether they have failed recently, rather than by how close they are to failing constantly. From a mathematical perspective, deterrence looked stable. Each side had strong incentives not to act. Each side understood the consequences. The equilibrium held. But equilibrium is a funny thing. It doesn't mean safety, it just means balance. A pencil balanced on its tip is in equilibrium too. Technically, mathematically, briefly, the Cold War equilibrium was similar. It relied on perfect understanding, perfect communication, and perfect self-control. It assumed that errors would be rare and that when they did occur, humans would respond calmly and correctly. That is a lot to ask of anyone, especially when the stakes involve extinction. Still, the logic marched on. Strategies were refined. Concepts like second strike capability were developed. The idea was that even if one side launched a surprise attack, the other side would still be able to respond with devastating force. This was meant to remove any incentive for a first strike. In practice, it meant building systems that could respond automatically, quickly, and with minimal human hesitation, which should probably have raised some concerns. But again, the math said it made sense. Speed reduced vulnerability. Automation reduced error. Reliability increased deterrence. The models were internally consistent. And internally consistent models are very convincing. As this thinking took hold, the emotional reality of nuclear weapons began to fade into the background. They became abstract tools, icons of power rather than instruments of suffering. When you talk about megatons and delivery systems long enough, it becomes easy to forget what those numbers represent. Cities, people, time itself, altered. But numbers don't flinch when you forget that. So planners focused on maintaining stability, on preserving the equilibrium, on ensuring that no one had an incentive to act. The irony, of course, is that this stability required constant preparation for catastrophe, endless drills, endless alerts, endless simulations of the end. Peace was maintained by rehearsing its destruction. This created a world where losing was no longer the opposite of winning. Losing became universal, absolute, final, and that changed everything. Because when losing means everyone loses, traditional strategy stops working. You can't bluff in the usual way, you can't afford small mistakes, you can't recover from miscalculations. Every decision becomes existential, and existential decisions do not like being rushed. Yet the systems being built were designed for speed, for decisiveness, for certainty. This tension sat quietly at the heart of nuclear strategy, a world where patience was essential, but reaction time was critical, where restraint was necessary but readiness was everything. From a distance, it all looked stable, balanced, logical. Up close, it was a tightrope stretched over nothing. Still, for now, the balance held, no one launched anything. The models continued to predict restraint. The equilibrium remained intact, and that was enough to keep everyone calm, or at least calm enough. But beneath this calm, something fragile was forming. A system that worked beautifully as long as everyone behaved exactly as expected. A system that did not forgive misunderstandings. A system that assumed that rationality would always win out over fear, which is a comforting belief, and a dangerous one. Because soon someone would notice that the equations holding this world together were making an assumption that reality had no obligation to respect. And that assumption was about to matter a great deal. John Nash did not enter this story like a hero. He sort of drifted in, quietly, slightly awkwardly, as if he wasn't entirely sure he was supposed to be here. Unlike von Neumann, Nash did not enjoy rooms full of people. He did not enjoy explaining himself. He did not enjoy small talk, or large talk, or really any talk that wasn't absolutely necessary. Conversations, to him, were inefficient systems. What he did enjoy was structure. Nash liked problems where chaos could be tamed, situations where conflicting interests could somehow settle into something stable, even if that stability was uncomfortable. He was fascinated by the idea that conflict didn't have to be resolved to be predictable. This made him perfect for the Cold War. Nash looked at games and saw something most people missed. He noticed that in many situations no one needed to cooperate for the system to stop changing. All that was required was that no one had an incentive to change their behavior. This is a subtle but powerful idea. You don't need trust. You don't need agreement. You don't even need peace. You just need everyone to be stuck. This idea became known as equilibrium. Not a happy ending, not a compromise, just a place where movement stops. To Nash, this was deeply comforting. It meant that even in a world full of selfish, suspicious, rational actors, stability could emerge, not because people wanted it, but because they couldn't improve their situation by acting alone. Think of it like a group project where nobody likes each other, nobody trusts each other, but everyone realizes that changing their part would only make things worse. So everyone quietly leaves things as they are. It's not harmony, it's exhaustion. Nash was not particularly interested in morality. He wasn't trying to make the world better in a philosophical sense. He was trying to understand it, to find patterns that held even when goodwill failed. This made his ideas incredibly attractive to people worried about nuclear war, because goodwill was in short supply. The Cold War was built on suspicion. Each side assumed the worst of the other. Every action was interpreted as a potential threat. Every silence was suspicious. Every movement demanded analysis. Nash's equilibrium offered a way to think about this without needing trust. If both sides understood that any aggressive move would make their own situation worse, then both sides would refrain from acting. Not because they liked each other, not because they felt safe, but because doing nothing was the least bad option. From a mathematical standpoint, this was elegant. From a human standpoint, it was unsettling. Equilibrium does not mean happiness. It does not mean justice. It simply means no one can unilaterally do better. And in nuclear strategy, better is a very low bar. Nash's work suggested that peace did not require cooperation. It required alignment of incentives. Fear could do the work that trust could not. This was a revolutionary idea. It reframed peace as a side effect of mutual anxiety, stability as a consequence of shared dread, and because it was mathematical, it felt solid. Objective, clean. There were no speeches about values here, no appeals to empathy, just logic. If you launch, you die. If you don't launch, you survive. Choose accordingly. Nash himself was not particularly comfortable with how his ideas were used. He was a theorist, a thinker. He did not design weapons or draft military doctrine, but his equilibrium concept fit nuclear strategy almost too well. It explained why the world could remain locked in a tense standoff for decades without tipping over. It gave planners a framework that made the madness seem stable, which is a strange thing to say, but an important one. Nash was also deeply suspicious of chaos. He disliked unpredictability. He found randomness unsettling. This was not just intellectual, it was personal. His own mind struggled with disorder, with intrusive thoughts, with patterns that refused to settle. So the idea that systems could stabilize themselves even under stress was profoundly appealing to him. Equilibrium was not just a mathematical concept, it was a kind of emotional refuge. This makes the story both more human and more tragic, because the same ideas that offered comfort also hid danger. Equilibrium assumes that players understand the game, that they see the same options, that they interpret signals in the same way. It assumes clarity. But the real world is noisy. Signals get distorted. Intentions get misread. Actions meant as defensive can look aggressive from the other side. And equilibrium, once disturbed, does not gently correct itself. It can snap. Nash's models did not account for panic, or pride, or accidents, or tired humans misreading screens at 3 in the morning. They assumed consistency. Still, the idea took hold. Equilibrium became a cornerstone of Cold War thinking, a quiet reassurance that even without trust, the system would hold. War, under this view, was not prevented by kindness, but by geometry, by the shape of incentives. This felt safer than relying on human virtue. And for a while, it worked. No one launched anything. The balance held, the equations remained stable, but stability can be deceptive. Because when a system depends on everyone behaving exactly as expected, it doesn't fail often, it only needs to fail once. And as we'll see next, the comfort of equilibrium would soon lead to a peace that no one had explicitly chosen, a peace that emerged not because humanity became wiser, but because the math accidentally cornered everyone at the same time, which is where things start to get truly strange. Equilibrium is a very calm word for a very uncomfortable idea. It sounds peaceful, balanced, like something you would want, like a room where nothing is falling over and no one is raising their voice. But equilibrium, in the way John Nash meant it, is not about happiness. It is about stillness. It is the moment when everyone stops moving, not because they are satisfied, but because moving would make things worse. To understand this without math, imagine a room with two doors. Each door leads somewhere unpleasant. One leads to embarrassment. The other leads to disaster. Everyone in the room can see both doors. Everyone knows that whichever door they choose, something bad will happen. So no one moves. That is equilibrium. In Nash's world, equilibrium happens when each player has chosen a strategy, and no one can improve their situation by changing their choice alone. You don't need cooperation. You don't need trust. You just need everyone to be trapped by their own logic. This is why equilibrium was so appealing to Cold War planners. They were not dealing with friendly neighbours. They were dealing with rivals who assumed the worst of each other at all times. Trust was not an option. Good intentions were not reliable, but fear was. If both sides feared the consequences of acting, then both sides would remain still. And stillness, in a nuclear world, looks a lot like peace. What made this idea powerful was that it didn't depend on anyone being good. It didn't depend on moral growth or mutual understanding. It worked even if everyone was selfish, paranoid, and deeply suspicious. In fact, it worked best under those conditions. Equilibrium doesn't care how you feel. It doesn't ask whether the outcome is fair. It simply notes that given the structure of the situation, movement is irrational. This was comforting to people who were tired of hoping. Instead of asking, will they be reasonable, planners could ask, do they have an incentive to act? And if the answer was no, that was enough. So equilibrium became the invisible foundation of nuclear peace. Not a treaty, not a handshake, just a shared recognition that disaster awaited anyone who blinked. From a distance, this looked elegant. From inside, it felt tense. Because equilibrium is not rest, it is suspension. Think of two people holding a heavy object between them. Neither wants to drop it, because if one lets go, it crashes down on both of them. So they hold it, quietly, muscles straining, smiling politely. As long as both keep holding, nothing happens. That's equilibrium. The Cold War was full of these invisible weights, missiles on alert, submarines underwater, bombers in the air, all of them held in place by the knowledge that letting go would be catastrophic. The math said this was stable, and mathematically, it was. But the math did not care how tired the people holding the weight were getting. One of the strangest things about equilibrium is that it can feel like progress even when nothing changes. The fact that yesterday looked like today was taken as evidence that the system was working. Time passed, nothing happened. Therefore, the equilibrium must be strong. This is a comforting illusion, because equilibrium does not eliminate danger. It organizes it. It takes chaos and arranges it into a shape that looks manageable. But the danger is still there, quietly humming beneath the surface. And the longer equilibrium holds, the more confidence people place in it. This confidence can become a problem. Once planners believed in equilibrium, they began to design systems around it. Weapons, communication channels, response protocols. Everything was optimized to maintain balance. The assumption was that as long as the equilibrium remained intact, the world was safe. This led to a peculiar mindset. Instead of asking, how do we avoid disaster, people began asking, how do we maintain equilibrium? Those are not the same question. Avoiding disaster might involve de-escalation, misunderstanding, or even admitting uncertainty. Maintaining equilibrium often meant reinforcing threats, increasing readiness, and demonstrating resolve. You had to show that you would not move first, but you also had to show that if the other side moved, you absolutely would respond. This required a kind of emotional choreography. Appear calm but not weak. Appear strong but not reckless. Appear predictable but not passive. Equilibrium demanded constant signalling, and signalling is easy to misinterpret. What one side sees as stability, the other might see as preparation. What one side sees as restraint, the other might see as hesitation. The math assumed that signals were clear, that intentions were legible, that everyone interpreted the game the same way. Reality, unfortunately, did not sign that agreement. Still, equilibrium felt safer than the alternatives. Without it, the world felt chaotic, unstable, prone to sudden disaster. With it, there was at least a framework, a cold, impersonal framework, but a framework nonetheless. And frameworks are comforting when the stakes are overwhelming. Nash's equilibrium did not promise a good outcome. It promised a consistent one, and in a nuclear world, consistency was priceless. No surprises, no sudden moves, no emotional decisions, just everyone quietly agreeing not to touch anything. This idea spread quickly. It influenced strategy documents, military planning, and political rhetoric. Leaders spoke of balance, stability, and deterrence as if these were natural laws rather than fragile arrangements. The equilibrium became invisible, taken for granted, and that is always dangerous. Because once a system becomes invisible, people stop questioning its assumptions. They stop asking whether the conditions that support it are still in place. They forget that equilibrium is not a law of nature. It is a temporary truce enforced by fear. The Cold War equilibrium worked as long as everyone believed in it, as long as everyone accepted the logic, as long as everyone behaved rationally, and for a long time they did, or at least they appeared to. But appearances can be misleading. Equilibrium does not announce when it is weakening. It does not creak or wobble in obvious ways. It looks the same right up until the moment it collapses. And when it collapses, it does not fail gently. This is the danger of building peace on a mathematical balance rather than a human one. Math assumes clarity. Humans live in ambiguity. The equilibrium that kept the world alive was real. It was powerful. It was in many ways miraculous, but it was also fragile. And it depended on one very important assumption, that everyone understood the game. Next, we will see what happened when peace was not chosen deliberately, but stumbled into accidentally. When stability emerged not from wisdom, but from a strange alignment of fear, logic, and timing. When peace itself became a side effect. And that is where the story takes a turn that no one, not even the mathematicians, had fully anticipated. One of the strangest things about the Cold War is that no one ever really sat down and agreed on peace. There was no moment where both sides shook hands and said, "All right, let's all calm down and not end the world." There was no shared vision of harmony, no collective sigh of relief, no mutual declaration of trust. Peace just sort of happened. Or more accurately, it didn't happen. And that was the point. What emerged instead was a long, tense pause. A pause held in place not by goodwill, but by logic. A peace that existed not because anyone wanted it, but because no one could find a rational way to break it. This is where things get unintentionally funny in a very dark way. The world did not avoid nuclear war because humans suddenly became wiser. It avoided nuclear war because the math accidentally trapped everyone in the same corner. Mutual assured destruction was never meant to feel comforting. It was meant to feel unavoidable. If you attack, you die. If you don't attack, you survive. That's it. No heroism, no glory, just consequences. And because those consequences were so final, the rational choice for everyone was to do nothing. This turned peace into a side effect, not a goal, not a value, just the byproduct of everyone being too scared to move. In earlier wars, peace was something you reached. In the nuclear age, peace was something you backed into slowly, hoping you didn't knock anything over on the way. The math behind this was brutally simple. If two players both have the ability to destroy each other completely, and both know this, then initiating conflict makes no sense. The worst possible outcome becomes guaranteed, so the best strategy is restraint. From the perspective of game theory, this is neat, elegant, efficient. From the perspective of human psychology, it's deeply unsettling. Peace built on fear is not peaceful. It's quiet, and quiet can be misleading. What made this even stranger is that the threat had to be believable. It wasn't enough to have weapons. You had to convince the other side that you were willing to use them, even though using them would be suicidal. So the system required a performance of madness. Leaders had to appear rational enough to understand the consequences, but irrational enough to actually carry them out if pushed. This is not a natural human state. It had to be carefully maintained. Speeches were calibrated. Military exercises were staged. Weapons were displayed just enough to remind everyone they were real. It was like two people standing in a room filled with explosives, calmly explaining to each other how they would absolutely set everything on fire if the other made a sudden move, and then agreeing that neither of them would move. The peace that resulted from this was stable, but brittle. It relied on constant vigilance, on endless reassurance through threat, on the assumption that everyone was always paying attention. Mathematically, this was fine. The equilibrium held as long as the incentives stayed aligned. But incentives are not static. They shift with technology, politics, pride, and misunderstanding. Still, the fact that nothing exploded felt like success. The longer peace lasted, the more people believed in it. It became normal, expected, almost boring. Which is dangerous, because boredom is when attention slips. One of the most uncomfortable truths about this era is that the absence of disaster made everyone more confident in the system. The models seemed validated. The equations seemed reliable. After all, look around. The world was still here. This is like driving toward a cliff in a car with good brakes, slowing down just enough to stop in time, and then concluding that cliffs are not actually that dangerous. The peace of the Cold War was not a moral achievement. It was a mathematical stalemate, a draw enforced by fear, and draws can last a long time, but they are not the same as safety. This accidental peace also had a psychological cost. Living under constant threat changes how people think. When annihilation is always one decision away, even ordinary choices take on a strange weight. The future feels conditional, provisional, like it exists only as long as no one makes a mistake. And that brings us to the most ironic part of all. The entire system was built on the assumption that mistakes would not happen, that rational actors would behave rationally, that information would be accurate, that signals would be clear. But humans are very good at making mistakes, especially when they are tired, or scared, or overconfident, or trying very hard to appear in control. The peace that emerged was not robust, it was delicate, balanced on assumptions that no one had seriously tested because testing them would be catastrophic. So instead, everyone trusted the math, and math, in turn, trusted everyone to behave. This is the moment where peace becomes an accident rather than a choice. It exists not because it is cherished, but because it is the least bad option available to everyone at the same time. A peace nobody planned, nobody celebrated, nobody fully understood. Just a long pause, stretched across decades, held together by equations and quiet fear. It worked, which only made it more terrifying, because a system that works by accident can also fail by accident, and as long as peace depended on everyone interpreting the math the same way, it was only as strong as its weakest assumption. The equations were elegant, the logic was sound, the world was still standing, which is exactly why no one noticed how close they were getting to the moment when the math would make its first serious mistake. And when math makes a mistake at this scale, it doesn't get a second chance. At some point, the calm became routine, not peaceful, just familiar. The meetings kept happening, the reports kept being written, the charts kept getting updated, and somewhere in the middle of all this quiet competence, a very dangerous belief settled in, that the system was safe because it had not failed yet. This is where the equation enters the story. Not a single equation written on a chalkboard with dramatic flair, but a whole family of models, strategic equations, decision frameworks, calculations designed to answer one central question. What will they do if we do this? These models were everywhere, in military planning, in political analysis, in classified documents stamped with words like deterrence and stability and response posture. They were treated with a kind of quiet reverence because they were mathematical, and mathematics has a reputation. It feels neutral, impartial, clean. It does not care who you are or what you believe. 2 plus 2 is always 4, even during a nuclear standoff. So when math entered the war room, it brought with it an illusion of objectivity, the sense that finally decisions could be made without emotion getting in the way. The equation did not get angry. The equation did not panic. The equation did not wake up at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat. The equation just sat there, patiently, offering answers, and people trusted it. The core idea behind these models was simple. Each side is rational. Each side wants to survive. Each side understands the consequences of escalation. Therefore, each side will act in predictable ways to avoid catastrophe. This assumption was so foundational that it rarely got questioned. It was treated as common sense. Of course they don't want to die. Of course they will act logically. Of course they understand the game. So planners built systems around this belief. They calculated optimal responses. They mapped out escalation ladders. They assigned probabilities to various actions, as if human behavior could be weighed and measured, like rainfall. These models did not predict peace. They predicted restraint, and restraint felt like peace. One of the most seductive aspects of these equations was how calm they made everything feel. When you reduce uncertainty to variables, fear becomes manageable. You can point to a number and say, this is unlikely, this is acceptable risk, this is stable. Numbers have a way of making danger feel smaller. If the probability of disaster is low enough, it starts to feel like it doesn't matter, even if the consequences are infinite. This is a well-known psychological trick. Humans are surprisingly comfortable with tiny probabilities of enormous catastrophe, as long as those probabilities stay abstract, and math is very good at abstraction. So the equation became a kind of emotional buffer, a way to distance decision-makers from the raw reality of what they were discussing. Instead of thinking about cities and people, they thought about payoffs and outcomes. Instead of asking what happens to millions of lives, they asked, what happens to the equilibrium? This shift was subtle but profound. Once the equation was trusted, it began to shape behavior rather than merely describe it. Leaders adjusted their actions to fit the model. They signaled in ways the model predicted. They responded in ways the model deemed rational. The model was no longer observing reality. It was actively creating it. This is a dangerous moment in any system. When a model becomes self-fulfilling, if everyone believes that certain actions will be interpreted in specific ways, then they begin acting as if those interpretations are guaranteed, and that can lock everyone into patterns they did not consciously choose. The equation everyone trusted did not say, be careful. It said, if you behave correctly, the system will hold, and so everyone focused on behaving correctly. But behaving correctly according to what? According to the model. This meant that deviations became suspicious. Anything unexpected had to be explained. Anomalies were treated as errors, either in data or in the other side's behavior. Rarely did anyone ask whether the model itself might be missing something, because the model had history on its side. It had worked yesterday, and the day before that, and the year before that. The world was still here. That fact alone gave the equation enormous authority. What people did not fully appreciate was how much faith was being placed in a few critical assumptions that were never proven, only accepted. That information would be accurate. That signals would be clear. That decisions would be deliberate. That fear would not overwhelm reason. These assumptions were not unreasonable. They were just optimistic. And optimism is a strange thing to build an apocalypse prevention system on. The equation was elegant. It was internally consistent. It produced outcomes that made sense within its own logic. But internal consistency is not the same as truth. A perfectly consistent model can still be perfectly wrong, especially if it assumes away the messiest part of reality, humans. The trust placed in these equations was not blind. It was cautious, professional, well-intentioned, but it was deep. And once trust reaches a certain level, questioning starts to feel unnecessary. Why doubt something that has not failed? This is how the most dangerous systems are built, not through recklessness, but through success, through repeated confirmation, through the quiet accumulation of confidence. By the time anyone started to feel uneasy, The equation was already embedded everywhere, in procedures, in training, in expectations. It was no longer just a tool. It was part of the structure of the world, and that made it very hard to step outside of it. Because stepping outside the equation meant stepping into uncertainty, and uncertainty was exactly what the math was supposed to protect against. So the equation stayed, trusted, respected, rarely questioned, and all the while it rested on a single assumption so basic, so obvious that no one thought to examine it too closely. The assumption that everyone involved was playing the same game, that everyone saw the same board, understood the same rules, interpreted the same signals, and that assumption was about to matter more than anyone realized, because the moment that assumption failed, the equation would not bend, it would snap, quietly, and without asking permission. Every model, no matter how elegant, begins with assumptions, not exciting assumptions, not dramatic ones, the quiet kind, the kind you write at the top of the page and then immediately forget about because they seem so obvious they barely count as choices. In this case, the assumption was simple. People are rational, not perfectly rational, not superhumanly logical, just rational enough to understand consequences, rational enough to avoid suicide, rational enough to interpret threats the way they were intended, rational enough to play the game. This assumption felt harmless, even generous. It was a vote of confidence in humanity, an expression of faith that when faced with extinction people would choose survival. And most of the time they did. But models are not interested in most of the time. They care about all of the time. The problem with assuming rational actors is not that people are irrational all the time, it's that they are irrational at the worst possible moments. Fatigue, fear, pride, confusion, boredom, miscommunication. These are not rare exceptions, they are constant features of human behavior, especially in high-pressure environments. Yet in the equation, these messy details were smoothed out, averaged away, treated as noise rather than signals. The model did not ask whether a human might panic. It assumed they would not. It did not ask whether information might be incomplete. It assumed clarity. It did not ask whether signals might be misread. It assumed shared understanding. These assumptions made the math workable. They also made it fragile. One of the most dangerous assumptions was the idea of perfect information. The belief that each side knew what the other side was capable of, what they intended, and how they would respond. In reality, information during the Cold War was anything but perfect. It was delayed, distorted, classified, filtered through layers of bureaucracy and interpretation. Radar screens glitched, sensors malfunctioned, messages were misunderstood, data arrived late or incomplete. And yet the model quietly assumed that everyone saw the same picture. This created a gap between the world as imagined and the world as experienced. In the imagined world, decisions were made calmly, with full awareness of consequences. In the real world, decisions were made by humans sitting in rooms, staring at blinking lights, wondering whether what they were seeing was real. The assumption of rationality also ignored something deeply human. People do not just respond to outcomes. They respond to stories. They respond to narratives about strength and weakness, about respect and humiliation, about being taken seriously, about not wanting to be the person who hesitated when everyone else expected action. None of this fits neatly into a payoff matrix. And yet, these are often the things that drive decisions. Another hidden assumption was consistency. The idea that a player's preferences remain stable over time, that survival is always the top priority, that no other value ever temporarily overrides it. History suggests otherwise. People have sacrificed themselves for pride, ideology, revenge, and misunderstanding. They have made irreversible decisions based on incomplete information and emotional momentum. The model assumed that survival always wins. Reality does not always agree, but perhaps the most subtle assumption of all was this: that everyone involved understood that they were part of a model, that they knew the game was being played. This may sound obvious, but it matters. For deterrence to work, both sides must believe in the logic of deterrence. They must recognize the equilibrium. They must trust that the other side is interpreting signals in roughly the same way. But belief is not guaranteed. Different cultures interpret threats differently. Different institutions reward different behaviors. What looks like restraint in one system can look like weakness in another. The equation assumed a shared mental model of the world. That is a big assumption to make about millions of people spread across different languages, histories, and political systems. When everyone believes in the same model, the model can shape reality. But when beliefs diverge, the model becomes a source of confusion rather than clarity. This is where things get dangerous, because the equation did not include a variable for misunderstanding. It treated misinterpretation as an error to be corrected, not as a fundamental risk, something unlikely, something marginal. But misunderstanding was not marginal, it was central. Consider how thin the line was between deterrence and provocation. A military exercise meant to demonstrate readiness could be seen as preparation for attack. A delay meant to signal restraint could be seen as indecision. The same action could have opposite meanings depending on context. The equation assumed context was shared. It wasn't. This led to a strange inversion. Instead of the model helping humans understand reality, humans began forcing reality to fit the model. They interpreted ambiguous events in ways that preserved the equilibrium. This sounds responsible. It is also risky. When you force ambiguous information into a rigid framework, you stop seeing warning signs. You explain away anomalies. You tell yourself that things make sense even when they don't. The assumption of rationality encouraged confidence. Confidence reduced hesitation. Reduced hesitation increased speed. And speed, in a nuclear system, is dangerous. The more the system relied on rapid response, the less room there was for doubt. The less time there was to ask, is this real? Automation crept in, quietly. Not full automation, but partial. Systems designed to assist decision-making, to flag threats, to recommend actions. Each layer of assistance was meant to reduce human error, but each layer also increased reliance on the model. When the model says, this is what a rational actor would do, it becomes very hard to argue against it in the moment, especially when the cost of being wrong feels unbearable. This is how the assumption that shouldn't have been there became invisible. It was everywhere, but rarely named. It sat beneath every calculation, every simulation, every plan. People are rational. Information is accurate. Signals are clear. The game is understood. As long as these remained true, the system held, but the system was not designed for moments when they failed. It had no graceful way to slow down, no mechanism for uncertainty, no space for doubt. When something unexpected happened, the equation did not say pause, it said respond. And that is the moment where rationality stops being a safeguard and starts being a trigger. Because once the model is trusted, deviations feel dangerous. Unexpected behavior feels threatening. Anomalies feel like the beginning of escalation. So the instinct becomes to act in ways that restore the model's predictions, to force reality back into equilibrium. Even if reality is trying to tell you something important, the assumption that humans would behave like the model predicted was not foolish. It was understandable. It was comforting. It made an unthinkable problem feel manageable. But it was still an assumption, and assumptions, when left unexamined, have a way of becoming invisible until the moment they fail. And when they fail inside a system designed to respond instantly, quietly, and with absolute confidence, the result is not confusion, it is action, which is why the next part of this story is not about chaos. It is about logic doing exactly what it was designed to do, and pushing the world one step closer to the edge. The strange thing about rational systems is that they are very good at doing exactly what they are told. They do not hesitate. They do not reflect. They do not ask whether the rules still make sense. They simply follow the logic to its conclusion. And most of the time that is a good thing. But in a system built to prevent catastrophe, perfect logic can become a problem. Because when rationality is embedded deeply enough, it stops being a guide and starts being a reflex. This is where the Cold War models became dangerous. Once the assumptions were in place, once the equations were trusted, and once the equilibrium was accepted as the natural state of things, any deviation from that equilibrium felt threatening. Not emotionally threatening, but logically threatening. If the system predicts restraint and restraint does not occur, then something is wrong. And in a nuclear context, something being wrong is not something you ignore. The models were designed to detect patterns, to notice shifts, to flag behavior that did not fit expectations. They were not designed to ask why those shifts occurred in a human sense. They were designed to respond. This created feedback loops. If one side adjusted its posture slightly, the other side's models would interpret that adjustment as meaningful, a signal, a potential escalation. The rational response would be to adjust in return. This adjustment would then be observed by the first side, whose own models would interpret it as confirmation of concern. And so the loop continued. Each side believed it was acting defensively. Each side believed it was restoring balance. Each side believed it was behaving rationally. The problem was that rationality, in this context, meant reacting quickly and decisively to preserve the equilibrium, which sounds reasonable, until you realize that both sides are doing it at the same time. This is how rational behavior can amplify fear, instead of reducing it. The models did not feel fear. They processed inputs. They categorized actions. They generated outputs. But the humans interpreting those outputs did feel fear. And fear does not slow down when wrapped in logic. It accelerates. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, staring at a screen that suddenly shows something unexpected. A blip, a pattern that shouldn't be there. The model tells you this could be significant. Not certain, but significant enough to consider. You know that if this is real, hesitation could be catastrophic. You also know that if it is not real, action could be catastrophic. The model offers guidance. It shows you what a rational response would look like. In that moment, rationality does not feel calming, it feels urgent. The feedback loops built into the system were meant to stabilize behavior, but under stress they did the opposite. They magnified small uncertainties into serious concerns. This is a known phenomenon in complex systems. When feedback is strong and time delays are short, systems can oscillate wildly in response to tiny disturbances. But at the time, this was not treated as a mathematical problem. It was treated as a procedural one. Follow the protocol. Trust the system. Respond as planned. The more automated and optimized the system became, the harder it was to interrupt. Human judgment was still present, but it was increasingly framed as a potential source of error rather than wisdom. After all, the whole point of the model was to reduce human mistakes. So when the model suggested a response disagreeing with it required confidence, and time, and courage, three things that are in short supply during a potential nuclear incident. This is where rationality becomes a trigger, not because logic is flawed, but because it is fast. The system rewards quick interpretation and decisive action. It does not reward hesitation. Hesitation looks like weakness. It looks like uncertainty. It looks like deviation from the optimal strategy. And deviation, in a deterrence framework, is dangerous. So the system nudges people toward action. Not dramatic action, not reckless action, just the next logical step, the appropriate response, the rational adjustment. Each step is small, reasonable, defensible, but the path they form leads somewhere very specific, closer to the edge. Another problem emerges here. Rational systems tend to interpret worst-case scenarios as the safest assumptions. If you assume the worst, you avoid being caught unprepared. This is sensible in many contexts. In nuclear strategy, it can be disastrous. If a signal is ambiguous, the rational move is to assume it could be hostile. If a movement could be preparation for attack, the rational response is to prepare as well. This mindset minimizes vulnerability, but it maximizes tension. When both sides adopt it, ambiguity disappears. Everything becomes a potential threat. The system becomes jumpy, and jumpy systems do not sleep well. The irony is that rationality was meant to reduce fear by making outcomes predictable. But under pressure, it does the opposite. It turns uncertainty into urgency. The model does not say, this is probably nothing. It says, this could be something, and the cost of being wrong is unacceptable. So the safest option becomes readiness. Heightened alert, increased monitoring, shortened response times. Each of these steps feels cautious, responsible, sensible, but together they create a system that is always on the verge of acting. At this point, the human role shifts subtly. Instead of making decisions, people begin to confirm them. The system presents options and humans validate them. This feels collaborative. It is not. The presence of a model changes how humans think. When a machine or framework suggests a course of action, rejecting it feels like introducing risk. Accepting it feels like following best practice. and best practice, especially in military contexts, carries authority. So rationality becomes self-reinforcing. The model predicts a response. The response occurs. The model is validated. Confidence increases. The next prediction is trusted even more. This cycle continues until the system is so confident in itself that doubt feels irresponsible. The terrifying part is that none of this requires malice. No one has to want war. No one has to make a dramatic mistake. All that is required is a sequence of rational decisions, each justified by the desire to avoid disaster. This is how logic, when unexamined, can lead directly toward the outcome it was designed to prevent. The Cold War came dangerously close to this scenario more than once. Signals misinterpreted, systems malfunctioning, humans hesitating just long enough to break the loop. In those moments, what saved the world was not the equation, it was hesitation. Someone pausing, someone doubting, someone feeling that something was off, even if the model said it wasn't. But hesitation was not built into the system. It survived in spite of it. The rational framework did not include uncertainty as a feature. It treated uncertainty as a problem to be eliminated. And when uncertainty cannot be eliminated, the system reacts. This is the paradox at the heart of rational deterrence. The more perfectly logical the system becomes, the less tolerant it is of ambiguity. And ambiguity is everywhere. The equation everyone trusted was never designed to handle surprise gracefully. It was designed to prevent deliberate aggression. It did not know what to do with accidents. And accidents are where humans live. When rationality becomes a trigger, it does not announce itself. It feels like responsibility, like competence, like doing your job. No one shouts. No one panics. The voice stays calm, and that is what makes it so dangerous. Because the most frightening decisions in this story were not made in anger. They were made quietly, logically, one reasonable step at a time. Which brings us to the moments when the world came closest to ending, not because someone chose destruction, but because the system calmly suggested it might be time to prepare. Moments when everything depended on someone deciding not to follow the math. And those moments, remarkably, were very ordinary. If the end of the world were dramatic, we might have noticed it sooner. If alarms had been screaming, if leaders had been shouting, if everyone had been running through hallways in slow motion, history would probably remember it differently. But the moments when the world came closest to ending were strangely mundane. They happened on ordinary days, in quiet rooms, with tired people staring at screens and wondering if they were misreading something. One of the most famous near misses began not with an explosion, but with a dot on a radar screen. It was late, the kind of late where your brain starts to blur the edges of reality. The room was dimly lit. The equipment was working the way it usually did, which is to say, imperfectly. Then something appeared. According to the system, several missiles had been launched. From the other side, heading in the right direction. This was, by definition, the worst possible signal. The procedures were clear. The model had already mapped out what this meant. The rational response was to confirm the signal and prepare for retaliation. Time was limited. Waiting too long could mean losing the ability to respond at all. Everything about the system pushed toward action. And yet, something felt wrong. The officer in charge looked at the data and hesitated. The number of missiles didn't make sense. The pattern didn't match what an actual attack would look like. The context felt off. The model did not include a variable for vibes. So the officer made a choice that the system did not encourage. He waited. It turned out the radar had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for incoming missiles. The world did not end, because someone decided that the math felt suspicious. There were other moments. A training tape accidentally loaded into a live system. A computer glitch that simulated an attack. A warning signal that propagated through networks faster than anyone could stop it. Each time the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It detected a threat. It escalated readiness. It prepared responses. And each time, a human noticed something small, something that didn't quite fit, and chose not to follow the logic all the way to its conclusion. These decisions were not heroic in the traditional sense. No speeches, no medals, just someone choosing to be uncertain. Which is an odd thing to celebrate. In one case, an officer was woken in the middle of the night and informed that an attack might be underway. He asked a question that the system did not expect. Why would they launch just a few missiles? The math did not have a good answer. So he waited. In another case, a computer system flagged an anomaly that suggested escalation. The protocol suggested raising alert levels. The response chain began moving, and then someone noticed that the data source was a single sensor, one sensor. Again, the system had no concept of common sense. It did not know that important decisions should not be based on one data point. It simply followed its rules. The world did not end because someone decided that one data point was not enough. These stories have a common theme. The math was not wrong, it was incomplete. The systems were excellent at detecting patterns. They were less good at understanding context. They could tell you what a rational response looked like, but not whether the situation deserved one. In each near miss, the danger did not come from aggressive intent. It came from misinterpretation, from errors in sensing, from perfectly ordinary technical failures. And because the stakes were so high, the system treated these failures as potential beginnings of catastrophe. This is where the logic of deterrence shows its weakness. It assumes that signals correspond to reality, that an alert means something is happening, that a warning is meaningful, but in complex systems, false alarms are inevitable. The more sensitive the system, the more false alarms it produces. This is a basic principle of detection theory. You can reduce missed threats or false positives, but not both at the same time. Nuclear systems were designed to avoid missed threats at all costs, which meant they accepted false alarms, a lot of them. Most were filtered out early. Some made it far, very far. And each one forced humans to confront the gap between what the model predicted and what reality might be doing. The terrifying part is how close these moments came to being resolved automatically, how thin the margin was between hesitation and response. If a different person had been in the room, if someone had been more tired, if someone had trusted the model just a little more, the outcome could have been different. These incidents were not the result of irrational behavior. They were the result of rational systems encountering imperfect information. The math assumed clarity. Reality provided noise. And in that noise, the system could not distinguish between danger and error without human judgment, which it was slowly trying to minimize. The humor in all this, if you can call it that, is how casual the near ends of the world were. No drama, no cinematic tension, just people quietly deciding not to do something. The apocalypse cancelled due to vibes. History tends to focus on decisive actions, declarations, battles, treaties. But in this case, what mattered most were moments of indecision. Someone pausing, someone doubting, someone choosing not to press a button. These were not acts of defiance, they were acts of hesitation. And hesitation is not something rational models value, which raises an uncomfortable question. If the system required humans to disobey it in order to survive, what does that say about the system? The Cold War did not end because the equations were flawless. It survived because they were ignored at critical moments, which is not a comforting conclusion, because it means that the safety of the world rested not on math, but on people feeling uneasy, on people trusting their instincts over their training, on people deciding that being perfectly rational was not always the right choice. The system did not collapse, but it also did not save itself. It was saved by humans choosing to be imperfect. And that is not something you can model. As we move forward, the question becomes more philosophical. If a system only works when people occasionally break its rules, is it actually working, or is it just getting lucky? That question will follow us as we look at why perfect strategies can be more dangerous than flawed ones, because sometimes it is the mistakes that keep us alive. One of the most seductive ideas in mathematics is the idea of optimality. There is something deeply comforting about believing that for every problem, there exists a best possible solution, not just a good one, not a reasonable one, the best one, the strategy that dominates all others, if only you can find it. This way of thinking works beautifully in many areas: engineering, logistics, scheduling, even games. If the rules are clear and the environment is controlled, optimal strategies can save time, money, and effort. The Cold War, unfortunately, was not a controlled environment, and yet much of its strategic thinking was built on the search for perfect strategies. The models asked questions like, What is the optimal response to a provocation? What is the optimal posture to maintain deterrence? What is the optimal balance between readiness and restraint? These are reasonable questions. The problem is, what happens when the answers are taken too seriously? A perfect strategy, by definition, assumes a stable world. It assumes that the rules do not change unexpectedly, that information is reliable, that players behave consistently, that the environment responds predictably, but the real world does not promise any of that. In fact, it actively resists it. When strategies are optimized too tightly, they lose flexibility, they become brittle, they perform extremely well under expected conditions and extremely poorly under unexpected ones. This is known in many fields, in biology, in engineering, in economics. Systems that are perfectly optimized for a narrow range of conditions tend to fail catastrophically when those conditions shift. The Cold War strategy of deterrence was optimized for deliberate, rational aggression. It was very good at preventing someone from choosing to start a nuclear war. It was much less good at handling accidents, false alarms, technical failures, miscommunications, human error. These were not the scenarios the strategies were optimized for, and because they were not optimized for them, they had no graceful response. When something unexpected happened, the system could not smoothly adapt, it could only escalate or ignore. Neither option was comforting. The models treated deviations as anomalies, things to be corrected rather than signals that the system itself might be vulnerable. This created a dangerous blind spot. The more confident people became in the strategies, the less willing they were to question them. After all, the strategies had worked. The world was still here. That felt like proof. But success can hide fragility. Consider a bridge that has never collapsed. That does not mean it cannot collapse. It may simply mean it has not yet encountered the conditions that would cause failure. Perfect strategies create the same illusion. They give the appearance of safety until the moment they don't. Another issue with perfect strategies is that they encourage uniformity. If one strategy is optimal, then everyone should use it. Deviating from it feels irrational. This reduces diversity of behavior. In complex systems, diversity is a form of resilience. Different responses to the same situation create buffers. They slow down cascades. They introduce friction. Perfect strategies remove that friction. When everyone responds the same way at the same speed, the system becomes tightly coupled. Small disturbances propagate quickly. Feedback loops intensify. This is exactly what you do not want in a system where mistakes can be fatal. The Cold War systems were designed for speed and consistency, rapid detection, rapid analysis, rapid response. The goal was to reduce vulnerability. The side effect was that there was very little room for reflection. Perfect strategies also assume that objectives are clear and unchanging. In nuclear strategy, the objective was often framed as survival. But survival is not a simple metric. Survival today, survival tomorrow, survival of what? Of whom? At what cost? These questions were often flattened into numbers, probabilities, expected outcomes, utility functions. This made them easier to work with. It also made them less human. A strategy can be optimal in terms of expected outcomes and still be unacceptable in reality, especially when outcomes are irreversible. The models did not struggle with this. They calculated expected values. They weighed risks. They produced recommendations. Humans had to live with the consequences. The pursuit of perfect strategy also created a moral distance. When decisions are framed as optimal, they feel less personal. Responsibility shifts from individuals to systems. The strategy made me do it. This is a comforting narrative. It is also dangerous, because it allows people to act without fully confronting the human impact of their actions. When a model recommends a response, following it feels like professionalism rather than choice. This further reduces hesitation. The irony is that the Cold War was survived not because the strategies were perfect, but because they were imperfectly applied. People hesitated. People doubted. People broke protocol when something felt wrong. These deviations introduced noise into the system. They slowed it down. They prevented rapid cascades. From a strict mathematical perspective, these were errors. From a survival perspective, they were essential. Perfect strategies aim to eliminate error. But in systems dealing with extreme consequences, error can be a safety feature. It creates slack. It absorbs shocks. It allows time for reconsideration. The Cold War deterrent system had very little built-in slack. It relied on human imperfection to supply it. This is not a robust design. A system that only works when people occasionally disobey it is not a system you should feel comfortable with. And yet, that is exactly what happened. The math was elegant. The strategies were optimal. The equilibrium was stable. Until it wasn't. The world avoided catastrophe, not because the strategies accounted for every possibility, but because reality kept intruding in messy, inconvenient ways. The models did not predict the importance of boredom, or skepticism, or intuition, or simple reluctance to act. But those things mattered. They mattered more than any equation, which leads us to a shift in tone, because eventually even the mathematicians began to notice that something about this felt wrong. That elegance and safety were not the same thing, that numbers were not neutral, and that the beauty of a strategy could hide its danger. When people who love math start worrying about math, it is usually worth paying attention, and that is what happens next. At first, the unease was quiet, not the kind of worry that makes headlines, not protests or dramatic resignations, just a subtle shift in tone, a pause where there used to be confidence, a sentence that ended with but instead of a period. The mathematicians noticed it before anyone else. This makes sense. They were the ones closest to the models, the ones who understood how much had been simplified, how many assumptions were hiding beneath the surface, doing heavy work without being acknowledged. When you build a model, you know what you leave out. And over time, some of them began to realize that what had been left out was not trivial. In the early years, mathematical models of nuclear strategy felt empowering. They brought clarity to a terrifying problem. They gave people something to hold on to, a sense that reason could still function in a world that had nearly destroyed itself. But clarity can turn into overconfidence. And overconfidence has a way of revealing itself only after it has settled in comfortably. Some mathematicians began to feel uneasy about how their work was being interpreted. Models that were meant to explore possibilities were being treated as prescriptions. Abstract frameworks were being mistaken for reality itself. The equation was no longer a tool, it was an authority. This made some of the people who helped build it deeply uncomfortable. They understood that models are maps, not territories, that they are useful precisely because they are incomplete, that their power comes from simplification, not from capturing everything. But in the war rooms, simplification was being mistaken for certainty. This is a classic problem in applied mathematics. A model works well enough so people start trusting it more than they should. Eventually they forget that it is a model at all. It just becomes how things work. Some mathematicians began asking questions that did not fit neatly into the frameworks they had helped create. What happens when information is wrong? What happens when signals are misread? What happens when fear overrides incentives? These questions did not have elegant answers. In fact, they were annoying questions. They complicated things. They introduced uncertainty back into a system that had been carefully designed to minimize it, which made them unpopular. There was also a growing discomfort with the moral distance created by the math. When outcomes are expressed as payoffs and probabilities, it becomes easier to talk about unimaginable destruction without feeling its weight. Some mathematicians worried that this distance was not a side effect, but a feature. The abstraction made it possible to discuss things that might otherwise be emotionally unbearable, but it also made it easier to normalize them. When you spend enough time discussing megadeaths as numbers, the numbers start to feel manageable. This troubled people who had chosen mathematics because they valued clarity and truth, because this felt like clarity without truth. Another source of concern was how the models handled uncertainty, or rather, how they didn't. Uncertainty was treated as something to be reduced, managed, or eliminated. But in reality, uncertainty was fundamental. It could not be removed. It could only be acknowledged. Some mathematicians began to argue that pretending uncertainty wasn't there was more dangerous than confronting it. A model that admits uncertainty forces caution. A model that pretends to be precise encourages action. This distinction matters a lot when action can end the world. There was also a growing awareness of how cultural and psychological factors were being ignored. The models assumed shared rationality, shared understanding, shared interpretations of risk. But people from different backgrounds do not always respond to the same incentives in the same way. What looks like restraint to one side can look like weakness to another. What looks like deterrence to one culture can look like provocation to another. These nuances were difficult to quantify, so they were often ignored. Some mathematicians tried to introduce these complexities into the models. They added layers. They built more elaborate frameworks. They attempted to capture uncertainty, misinterpretation, and non-rational behavior. The result was not comforting. The more realistic the models became, the less stable they looked. Instead of neat equilibria, they produced messy dynamics, oscillations, instabilities, sensitivity to small changes. In other words, they started to look like the real world. And the real world, it turned out, was not very reassuring. This created an uncomfortable tension. The simpler models were stable but unrealistic. The realistic models were unstable and frightening. Which should you trust? Some mathematicians began to feel that the entire approach might be flawed, that reducing nuclear strategy to optimization problems missed something essential, not a technical detail, something fundamental, human meaning. People do not just act to maximize survival, they act to preserve identity, dignity, and narrative. They act based on how they believe they are seen. They act to avoid shame as much as to avoid death. These motivations do not fit neatly into equations, and yet they matter. As these doubts grew, some mathematicians tried to speak up. They wrote papers, they raised concerns, they emphasized the limits of their models. Often these warnings were politely acknowledged and quietly sidelined. After all, the system was working. No one had launched anything. The equilibrium held. Why complicate a success? This is another common human mistake. Confusing survival with safety. Confusing luck with robustness. The mathematicians who worried were not alarmists. They were not predicting imminent disaster. They were pointing out fragility. They were saying, this system depends on everything going right, all the time, and systems like that do not age well. There was also an ethical discomfort that grew over time, a sense that mathematical elegance was being used to justify morally horrifying possibilities, not because anyone wanted them, but because the math made them seem inevitable. This made some mathematicians uneasy with their own role. They had entered the field to understand the world, not to help design its destruction, even indirectly. For some, this led to withdrawal, for others to activism, for many to quiet internal conflict. They continued doing the math, but they no longer believed it told the whole story. The most honest among them admitted something unsettling. The models were not wrong, they were just not enough. They captured one slice of reality very well, but they ignored the parts that refused to be tamed. Fear, pride, fatigue, misunderstanding, boredom. The things that saved the world during near misses were not in the equations. They were in people. This realization marked a turning point. Not in policy, not immediately, but in perspective. The math had given humanity a way to survive the nuclear age so far, but it had also brought it terrifyingly close to the edge. The mathematicians who began to worry were not rejecting math. They were asking for humility. They were reminding everyone that equations are tools, not guardians. That logic is not wisdom, that models do not absolve responsibility. They were saying something very simple. Math can help us think. It cannot replace thinking. And when the stakes are this high, confusing the two can be fatal. The system had not failed yet, but it had revealed something important. That the world was not being held together by equations, it was being held together by people choosing, again and again, not to trust them completely. Which leads us to the quiet heroes of this story. Not the mathematicians, not the generals, but the imperfect humans who did not fit the model, and who, by doing so, may have saved everything. If you look closely at the moments when the world almost ended, a strange pattern emerges. It was never the system that saved itself. The equations did not stop escalation. The models did not slow things down. The protocols did not pause to reflect. People did. And not because they were brilliant or brave or especially wise, but because they were human. Tired, bored, skeptical, uneasy. These are not qualities that show up in strategic models. There is no variable for this feels weird or I don't like the look of this or maybe we should wait a minute. But those moments mattered more than any calculation. In nearly every near miss, the system behaved exactly as designed. Sensors detected anomalies, alerts were triggered, procedures unfolded smoothly and efficiently, information moved up the chain. Nothing broke, except the assumption that humans would follow the system all the way to its conclusion. Someone hesitated. Sometimes it was because they were unconvinced by the data. Sometimes it was because the situation didn't fit the story they expected. Sometimes it was because they simply didn't feel ready to make a decision that large on that little information. These moments of hesitation were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of discomfort. And discomfort is not something rational systems handle well. From the perspective of the model, hesitation is noise. It is inefficiency. It slows down response time. It introduces risk. From the perspective of survival, hesitation was everything. The people who hesitated were not rejecting logic. They were supplementing it with something the model did not have: context. They noticed patterns that were not captured by equations, a launch that didn't make strategic sense, an alert that didn't match known behavior, a scenario that felt too small, too strange, too wrong to justify the ultimate response. They asked questions the model did not ask. Why now? Why this way? Why so few? The math could not answer these questions. It was not designed to. It could only say, if this is real, then respond. The humans asked a different question. Is this real? This distinction is subtle but critical. The system assumed that reality was already known, and that the problem was how to react to it. The humans understood that determining reality was part of the problem. This is where imperfection becomes a strength. Humans are inconsistent. They doubt themselves. They second guess. They hesitate. In most systems, these traits are flaws. In a nuclear system, they were safeguards. Boredom played an unexpected role as well. People working long shifts in monitoring stations learned what normal looked like. They developed an intuitive sense for the rhythm of the system. When something deviated from that rhythm, it stood out. Not as a calculation, as a feeling. The system did not know what normal felt like. It only knew thresholds. Humans knew when something felt off. Fatigue also mattered. Tired people make mistakes, yes, but they also lose patience for unnecessary drama. They are less impressed by alarms that cry wolf too often. They become suspicious of urgency without explanation. This skepticism slowed things down. Slowness is dangerous in some contexts. In this one, it was life-saving. Emotion, often treated as an enemy of rationality, turned out to be a crucial check on it. Fear made people cautious. Anxiety made them double-check. Unease made them pause. These emotional responses were not random. They were shaped by experience, by an awareness of consequences that went beyond numbers. The models treated outcomes as abstract. Humans felt their weight. This difference mattered. Another important factor was responsibility. The people making these decisions understood, on a visceral level, that they were accountable, not to a model, to history, to humanity. The system distributed responsibility across procedures and chains of command, but at the moment of decision, it collapsed back onto an individual. Someone had to say yes, and saying yes felt wrong. The weight of that choice was not captured by expected values or payoff matrices. It lived in the imagination, in the awareness that there would be no undo. The people who hesitated were not thinking in terms of equilibrium. They were thinking in terms of consequence. What happens after? The math stopped at the outcome. Humans extended the story beyond it. This is another thing models struggle with. They optimize for endpoints. Humans think in narratives. They imagine futures. They consider meaning. Ending the world is not just an outcome. It is the end of all outcomes. No model can really handle that. So the humans stepped outside the model. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly, by choosing not to act immediately. This was not a designed feature of the system. It was a leak. And that leak saved everything. From a strict engineering perspective, this is a problem. You do not want safety to depend on people breaking the rules. You do not want survival to rely on intuition and luck. But that is exactly what happened. The Cold War system survived because it was imperfectly executed, because humans did not behave like the rational actors they were assumed to be. They were slower, more cautious, more emotional, more uncertain. And that uncertainty created space. Space for doubt, space for clarification, space for mistakes to be corrected before becoming irreversible. This flips the usual narrative of human error on its head. In most systems, human error is something to be eliminated. In this system, human error was the buffer between existence and extinction. The irony is almost unbearable. The math was designed to prevent war by assuming humans would behave rationally. War was prevented because humans behaved irrationally, or at least not as the model expected. This does not mean that logic was useless. The models provided structure. They helped people think. They framed the problem. But they were not enough on their own. They needed humans to temper them, to slow them, to question them. They needed imperfection. The lesson here is not that math is dangerous, or that humans should ignore reason. It is that systems designed for extreme stakes must include room for doubt. They must allow for hesitation. They must accept that not everything can be calculated in advance. The Cold War deterrence system did not include this explicitly. It relied on it implicitly, which is a risky way to survive, because humans do not always hesitate in the right direction. The fact that things worked out is not proof of design. It is proof of luck, and luck is not a strategy. Still, the world survived, not because the math was flawless, but because people were flawed, uncertain, hesitant people who did not trust the equation completely, people who allowed fear and intuition to interrupt logic, people who in moments that mattered chose not to be perfectly rational. This is an uncomfortable conclusion for a story about mathematics, but it is an honest one, and it leads to a deeper insight. The equation that almost started a nuclear war did not fail because it was wrong. It almost succeeded because it was right. And only because humans refused to let it finish its work did the world remain intact. Which brings us to the strangest realization of all. The system did not work despite fear. It worked because of it, and that is a paradox worth sitting with. At first glance, fear seems like the enemy of rational thinking. It makes people hesitate. It clouds judgment. It introduces emotion into situations that are supposed to be handled calmly and logically. In most decision-making frameworks, fear is something to be minimized, managed, or eliminated. But the Cold War revealed something deeply uncomfortable. Fear was not a bug in the system. It was a feature. The entire logic of nuclear deterrence depended on fear, not panic, but a steady, ever-present awareness of consequence. The fear of retaliation, the fear of escalation, the fear of ending everything. Without fear, the equations would not have worked at all. This is where the story takes an ironic turn. The models assumed rational actors who wanted to survive, but wanting to survive is not enough. You also have to feel what not surviving means. You have to emotionally grasp the weight of the outcome. Fear supplied that weight. The equation did not calculate fear, it required it. Deterrence only works if the threat is believed, and belief is not a logical state, it is an emotional one. You don't just understand that something would be catastrophic, you have to feel it. This is why early nuclear strategy placed so much emphasis on credibility, on convincing the other side that you were capable of destruction and willing to follow through. The threat had to be emotionally real. But here is the paradox. Fear stabilizes the system only if it remains controlled. Too little fear, and people become reckless. They test boundaries. They assume the other side won't really respond. The equilibrium weakens. Too much fear, and people panic. They rush decisions. They interpret ambiguity as threat. The equilibrium collapses. So the system required a very specific kind of fear. A calm fear. A fear that makes you cautious but not desperate. A fear that slows you down but does not freeze you. A fear that keeps you awake but not hysterical. This is an extraordinarily delicate emotional state to maintain across entire institutions and nations. And yet, that is exactly what deterrence depended on. The equation everyone trusted needed humans to feel afraid in the right way, at the right time, and to the right degree. This is not something math is good at guaranteeing. The models treated fear as an implicit constant. It was assumed to be there, evenly distributed, stable. But fear is not stable. It fluctuates, it spikes, it fades, it gets distorted by politics, media, and personal experience. One generation that lives through a near miss, feels fear differently from one that grows up during a long period of calm. As time passed without catastrophe, fear softened. The threat remained abstract. The weapons stayed unused. The world kept turning. This created a dangerous illusion. The system that required fear to function was slowly eroding the very thing it depended on. This is another hidden fragility of deterrence. Its success undermines its foundation. The longer peace lasts, the harder it becomes to feel the fear that keeps peace in place. People who had lived through World War II understood destruction viscerally. They had seen cities burned, lives erased. The idea of total annihilation did not feel theoretical. Later generations experienced the Cold War as background noise, a distant threat, something that existed in headlines and drills, but not in memory. For them, fear became conceptual rather than emotional, and conceptual fear does not restrain behavior in the same way. This shift worried some thinkers deeply. If deterrence works because people are afraid, what happens when fear fades? The equation did not have an answer. Another problem with fear is that it does not distribute evenly. Some people feel it more strongly than others. Some grow numb to it. Some react to it with caution. Others with defiance. The model assumed a uniform response. Reality did not cooperate. This is why humans were needed inside the system, not to eliminate fear, but to interpret it, to recognize when fear was appropriate and when it was misleading. The near misses showed this clearly. The officers who hesitated were afraid, but they were afraid of being wrong, afraid of acting on incomplete information, afraid of making an irreversible mistake. This fear pushed them to pause. The system itself was afraid of something else. It was afraid of vulnerability, of being caught unprepared, of hesitation being exploited, so the system pushed toward readiness. These fears were in tension, and that tension mattered. If the system's fear had dominated completely, escalation would have been automatic. If human fear had been ignored, caution would have vanished. The survival of the world depended on these fears balancing each other. This is not how systems are usually designed. Most systems aim to reduce emotional influence, to standardize responses, to make behavior predictable. The Cold War system required emotional judgment to function correctly. It needed people to feel the weight of decisions in ways that models could not represent. This reveals a deeper truth about extreme risk systems. When the consequences are absolute, logic alone is insufficient. Logic can tell you what follows from a decision. It cannot tell you whether you should make it. Fear fills that gap. Not fear as panic, but fear as respect for consequence. In everyday life, fear is often treated as weakness. In this context, it was wisdom. The people who saved the world did not do so because they were fearless. They did so because they were afraid in a very specific way. They were afraid of the finality of their actions, afraid of the possibility that the system was wrong, afraid of trusting a model more than their own uncertainty. This fear made them slow down, and slowing down mattered. The equation that almost started a nuclear war did not fail because it ignored fear. It failed because it assumed fear would behave predictably. It assumed fear would always reinforce rational restraint. But fear is not a constant. It is dynamic. It reacts to context. It changes over time. The system survived because humans adapted their fear to the situation rather than following the model blindly. This is an uncomfortable lesson. It suggests that safety did not come from eliminating emotion, but from integrating it, from allowing fear to interrupt logic when logic became too confident. The equation needed fear to function, but it also needed fear to resist it. This double role is hard to formalize. You cannot write an equation that says, follow this logic until it feels wrong, then stop. And yet, that is exactly what saved the world. The Cold War did not end in nuclear fire, but it also did not end because the math was flawless. It ended because humans navigated the space between logic and fear without collapsing into either. They did not trust fear alone. They did not trust math alone. They lived in the tension. And that tension, uncomfortable as it was, proved more stable than any equilibrium on paper. As the Cold War faded, the equations remained, the models survived. Game theory spread into economics, politics, and technology. But the context changed, the fear changed, and with it, the risks. Because the next time we build systems that operate at the edge of catastrophe, we may not be so lucky, and we may not be so afraid, which raises a troubling question. If fear was the missing variable that made the equation work, what happens when we design systems that remove humans entirely, systems that do not feel fear at all? That question does not belong to the past. It belongs very much to the present. And that is where this story starts looking uncomfortably familiar. When the Cold War ended, it did not end with a final equation being crossed out. There was no moment where someone stood up, wiped the chalkboard clean and said, "Well, that was terrifying, let's never do that again." Instead, the world changed slowly. Borders shifted, walls fell, tensions eased, the constant background hum of annihilation faded into something quieter, and the math stayed. The equations did not go away, the models did not retire, they simply found new homes: game theory, optimization, strategic modeling. These ideas spread outward from military planning into economics, politics, technology, and eventually everyday life. The logic that once governed nuclear standoffs began shaping markets, elections, negotiations, and algorithms. At first, this felt like progress. After all, if these tools could help prevent nuclear war, surely they could help with less apocalyptic problems. Pricing airline tickets, designing auctions, allocating resources, predicting behavior, and in many cases they did. The models became more sophisticated. Computers replaced chalkboards, data replaced intuition, optimization became faster, more precise, more confident, but the assumptions often remained the same. Rational actors, clear incentives, stable preferences. These assumptions work reasonably well in controlled environments. Markets with many participants, systems where feedback is frequent and consequences are limited. They become more dangerous as the stakes increase. The lessons of the Cold War were not fully absorbed. The fact that the system survived because humans disobeyed it was not built into future designs. Instead, the survival was attributed to the system itself. The models worked. This is a comforting story. It is also incomplete. As mathematics spread into new domains, the same pattern reappeared. Models began as tools and slowly became authorities. Decisions were justified by outputs. Responsibility shifted from people to systems. The phrase "the algorithm says" replaced "the model suggests." This shift matters. When a system is treated as advisory, humans remain accountable. When it is treated as authoritative, human judgment becomes a liability. This is exactly the inversion that made nuclear strategy so fragile. The Cold War should have taught us to be cautious about optimization at the edge of catastrophe. Instead, it taught us to trust models that seem to work. Nowhere is this more evident than in the development of automated decision-making systems. From financial trading to military defense to content moderation, algorithms increasingly act at speeds humans cannot match. Speed is valued, efficiency is rewarded, hesitation is penalized. These are the same pressures that shaped nuclear deterrence systems. The difference is that now the systems are faster, more interconnected, and less transparent. And they still struggle with the same fundamental problem. They do not understand context. They can detect patterns, they can optimize outcomes, they can respond to changes, but they do not know when to pause. They do not know when something feels wrong. The Cold War systems relied on humans to provide that pause, to slow things down when the math moved too quickly, to question outputs that did not fit the larger picture. As systems become more automated, that human role shrinks. This is not inherently bad. Automation can reduce error. It can handle complexity beyond human capacity. It can process information more reliably. But when automation is applied to high-stakes decisions, the old assumptions return: that the model understands the game, that the inputs reflect reality, that the outputs are appropriate. These assumptions were risky then. They are riskier now. The modern world is filled with systems that interact in complex ways. Financial markets can crash in milliseconds. Information spreads instantly. Small errors can cascade across networks. We have built systems that operate faster than human fear, and that should worry us. Fear, as uncomfortable as it is, plays a role. It slows us down, it forces reflection, it reminds us of consequence. When systems act without fear, they act without that restraint. This does not mean machines are evil or that math is dangerous. It means that optimization without humility is risky. The Cold War taught us that systems designed to prevent catastrophe can become its greatest threat if they are trusted too much. It taught us that stability can hide fragility. It taught us that success can be misleading. These lessons are easy to forget when the immediate danger fades. Mathematics continues to shape the world in profound ways. It helps us understand complex systems. It enables technologies that would have seemed miraculous a generation ago. But the story of the equation that almost started a nuclear war is a reminder. Math is powerful. Math is persuasive. Math is not wise. Wisdom comes from knowing when to stop optimizing, when to leave space for doubt, when to accept that not everything can be calculated. The Cold War did not end because the equations were perfected. It ended because the context changed, because fear shifted, because humans stepped back from the edge. The math remained useful. It just stopped being existential, for now, but the patterns are still with us. The temptation to trust models, to automate decisions, to optimize systems beyond human comprehension, and the same assumptions still lurk beneath the surface, that people are rational, that information is accurate, that systems behave as expected. These assumptions are comforting. They are also dangerous. The story of nuclear deterrence is not just history, it is a case study, a warning written in equations and near misses rather than ruins. It shows us what happens when math is asked to carry more responsibility than it can handle, and it leaves us with a choice. We can treat models as tools, or we can treat them as authorities. We can design systems that include hesitation, or systems that eliminate it. We can remember that the world survived because humans sometimes ignored the math. Or we can forget, and forgetting would be a very rational mistake, because the next time we build a system that operates at the speed of catastrophe, we may not have the luxury of quiet hesitation, we may not have someone in the room who decides to wait, and we may not notice how close we are getting to the edge until we are already there, which brings us gently to the end of this story. Not with an explosion, but with a question. What do we do with math? Now that we know what it almost did, that question does not need an answer tonight. It just needs to linger, quietly. Like everything else in this story, there is a strange relief in admitting that you don't know. Not ignorance, not confusion, just an honest acceptance that some things cannot be fully predicted, controlled, or reduced to numbers. After decades of living under equations that promised stability, this realization felt almost peaceful. The Cold War had trained the world to believe that safety came from understanding everything, from modeling every possibility, from anticipating every move. Uncertainty was treated as a threat in itself. But over time, people began to notice something counterintuitive. Trying to eliminate uncertainty entirely was exhausting, and possibly impossible. The systems designed to manage nuclear risk were built on the assumption that uncertainty could be pushed far enough into the margins to be ignored, that with enough data, enough modeling, and enough analysis, the world could be made predictable. The near misses told a different story. They showed that uncertainty was not a flaw to be eliminated. It was a condition to be respected. In every moment when disaster was avoided, someone had accepted uncertainty instead of fighting it. They had chosen to wait rather than act, to ask questions rather than follow procedures. This acceptance of not knowing was not passive. It was active restraint. It required confidence of a different kind. Not confidence in the model, but confidence in one's own judgment to pause. This kind of confidence is harder to formalize. It does not come from equations or simulations. It comes from experience, humility, and an awareness of limits. The Cold War rewarded people who could live with ambiguity, who could sit with incomplete information without rushing to resolution. This is not a skill that optimization encourages. Optimization seeks clarity. It pushes toward decisions. It favors action over inaction. But when the cost of action is irreversible, inaction can be the most responsible choice. The comfort of not knowing comes from recognizing that uncertainty creates space. Space for dialogue, space for correction, space for reality to reveal itself more fully. When systems demand immediate certainty, they collapse that space. The nuclear age taught humanity, painfully and indirectly, that some questions should not be answered too quickly. Is this a real attack? Is this the right moment? Is this the only option? These questions lose their protective power when answers are forced. There is also a deeper philosophical comfort in not knowing. It reminds us that control is limited, that the world is not a machine we can fully master. That humility is not weakness, but awareness. Mathematics is often associated with certainty, with proofs and definitive answers. But the most honest mathematics also acknowledges uncertainty, error margins, assumptions, conditions under which results hold. When math forgets this, it becomes ideology. The Cold War models worked best when they were treated as approximations, as guides, as ways to think rather than rules to follow. The trouble began when they were treated as truths. Accepting uncertainty does not mean rejecting math. It means placing it in context, recognizing that models are lenses, not mirrors. They show us something useful, but never everything. The comfort of not knowing is the comfort of remembering that the world is bigger than our descriptions of it. This realization can feel unsettling at first, especially in a culture that prizes control and prediction. But it can also be grounding. It shifts focus from domination to stewardship, from optimization to care. In the nuclear age, this shift was essential. The people who hesitated did not do so because they lacked knowledge. They did so because they understood the limits of knowledge. They knew that certainty in those moments was an illusion, and illusions are dangerous when acted upon. The Cold War's quiet ending allowed space for reflection, for reconsideration, for the slow rebuilding of trust, however fragile. It also allowed a re-examination of the role of mathematics in human affairs, not as a final authority, but as a companion to judgment, a way to inform decisions, not replace them. This is a gentler role for math, less glamorous perhaps, but more honest. The comfort of not knowing does not mean abandoning effort. It means acknowledging that some risks cannot be fully eliminated, only managed. It means designing systems that expect surprise rather than deny it. It means valuing hesitation as much as decisiveness. These lessons are not always convenient. They slow things down, they resist automation, they require patience, but patience is a form of respect for consequence. As the world moves forward, the temptation to replace uncertainty with models remains strong. The desire to believe that everything can be calculated is deeply human. The story of the equation that almost started a nuclear war suggests otherwise. It suggests that survival depends not on eliminating uncertainty, but on learning to live with it, on allowing space for doubt, on accepting that not knowing is sometimes the safest state. This is not a dramatic conclusion. It does not offer a solution or a formula. It offers something quieter, permission to pause. And in a world that moves increasingly fast, that permission might be one of the most valuable things we can have, which brings us gently toward the end, not with answers, but with a kind of calm, a calm that comes from recognizing limits, and from trusting that some things are better left unresolved, at least for now. By this point, it's tempting to think that this story is really about math, about equations that were too elegant, models that were too confident, logic that went a little too far and almost took everything with it. But that's not quite right. This story is not really about math at all. It's about us. The math didn't wake up one morning and decide to manage nuclear weapons. Humans did. The equations didn't demand authority. We handed it to them. The models didn't insist on being trusted completely. We trusted them because we wanted to. And that desire says something important. Humans have always wanted control over nature, over each other, over the future. The invention of mathematics gave us a powerful way to understand patterns and make predictions, and with that power came a hope that maybe if we understood the world well enough we could finally make it safe. The nuclear age tested that hope in the most extreme way possible. We created a technology that could end everything, and then immediately looked for a way to contain it, to box it in with logic, to surround it with equations and protocols and strategies that promised stability. This was not foolish. It was deeply human. Faced with something terrifying, we reached for the tools that had helped us survive before. Reason, structure, calculation. What we learned is that those tools are powerful, but not complete. The Cold War revealed a tension at the heart of human thinking. We want certainty, but we live in a world that does not offer it. We want systems that behave predictably, but we ourselves are unpredictable. So we build systems that assume the best version of us, rational, consistent, calm, and then we fail to live up to them. Sometimes that failure saves us. The near misses show that our survival depended on people being skeptical, hesitant, and occasionally disobedient, on people feeling uncomfortable enough to pause. These are not traits we usually celebrate. They are messy, inefficient, hard to measure, but they are deeply human. This story also reveals something about how we relate to responsibility. When decisions are framed mathematically, they feel less personal. The outcome becomes the result of a process rather than a choice. This is appealing. It allows us to distance ourselves from the consequences of our actions, to say that we followed the model, that we did what made sense, that the numbers left no alternative. The Cold War shows how dangerous that mindset can be. At the moments that mattered most, responsibility snapped back into focus. Someone had to decide whether to act. The model could advise, but it could not choose. And in those moments, the people who mattered most were the ones who felt that responsibility fully, not as an abstract duty, but as a weight. What does this say about us? It says that we are uncomfortable with uncertainty, but capable of living with it when we must. It says that we crave rules, but sometimes know when to break them. It says that we are capable of building systems that exceed our wisdom, and then relying on our wisdom to stop them. This is not flattering, but it is honest. It also says something about our relationship with intelligence. We often assume that smarter systems will lead to safer outcomes, that better predictions will reduce risk. The Cold War complicates that story. Intelligence without humility is dangerous. Optimization without context is fragile. Systems that assume perfection invite catastrophe. What saved the world was not superior intelligence, but restraint. Not certainty, but doubt. Not flawless logic, but human judgment. This suggests that wisdom is not the same as knowledge, that understanding how something works is not the same as knowing how it should be used. Math gave us incredible insight into strategic behavior. It showed us patterns we might not have seen otherwise. It helped structure thinking around an unthinkable problem, but it could not tell us when to stop thinking. That part had to come from somewhere else, from values, from empathy, from fear, from imagination, from imagining what it would mean for everything to end. This story also invites us to reflect on how we tell stories about progress. We like to believe that history moves forward because we get smarter, more rational, more efficient. The Cold War suggests a different picture. Sometimes progress happens because we realize the limits of our intelligence, because we step back, because we accept that some problems cannot be solved, only survived. And survival, in this case, depended on restraint. It depended on people choosing not to use the most powerful tools they had created. That choice is easy to overlook, because nothing happened. No explosion, no collapse, just the quiet continuation of ordinary life. But that quiet was earned. The story of the equation that almost started a nuclear war is not a warning against math. It is a warning against forgetting who math is for. Equations do not bear responsibility. People do. Models do not feel consequence. People do. Systems do not care whether the future exists. People do. What this says about us is that we are capable of holding contradictory things at once. We can build terrifying systems and then refuse to let them run unchecked. We can trust reason and still listen to intuition. We can respect math without worshipping it. We are not perfectly rational, and that might be our greatest strength, because perfect rationality, in a world where mistakes are irreversible, leaves no room for mercy, no room for hesitation, no room for being wrong and surviving it. The Cold War ended without catastrophe, not because we solved the problem of war, but because we lived with it carefully, because we accepted that some risks could not be eliminated, only managed, because we chose again and again not to follow the logic all the way to its final conclusion. That choice says something important about us. It says that beneath our love of certainty, we understand something deeper. That existence is fragile, and that preserving it sometimes means refusing to be perfectly logical, which leaves us with one final quiet thought. If our imperfections saved us once, perhaps the goal should not be to eliminate them. Perhaps the goal should be to remember why we needed them in the first place. So here we are, at the end of a story about the end of the world that never happened. No explosions, no ruins, no final scene, just continuation. That in itself is kind of remarkable. For decades, humanity lived with a machine pointed at its own head, carefully adjusting the angle, checking the math, and telling itself that everything was under control. And somehow nothing happened. Not because the machine was harmless, not because the equations were perfect, but because at the last moment, again and again, someone chose to slow down. This is not a triumphant ending. There is no moral victory here. No clear lesson that wraps everything up neatly and makes us feel smarter than the people who came before us. If anything, it should make us feel a little uneasy, because the equation that almost started a nuclear war did not disappear. It was not destroyed. It did not get proven wrong in some satisfying way. It just stopped being used in that context. The ideas survived. The math survived. The logic survived. We are still very good at building systems that are fast, confident, and persuasive. Systems that promise control. Systems that tell us what the rational thing to do is. And we are still very tempted to listen to them. What changed, at least for a while, was our awareness of the cost. The nuclear age forced humanity to confront a truth that is easy to ignore at smaller scales. Some mistakes cannot be corrected. Some decisions do not come with a retry button. Some outcomes end the story. And when that is the case, being a little slow, a little uncertain, a little afraid, is not a weakness. It is a safeguard. The Cold War did not end because we solved the equation of peace. It ended because we learned, imperfectly and temporarily, to live with a problem we could not solve. We learned to coexist with danger without constantly poking it. We learned to leave some things untouched. That lesson did not come from math. It came from living with the consequences of what math had made possible. The equation that almost ended the world taught us something by failing. It taught us that intelligence is not the same as wisdom. That prediction is not the same as understanding. That control is not the same as care. And perhaps most importantly, it taught us that silence can be an achievement. Nothing happening is sometimes the best possible outcome. As you listen to this now, the world is still here, which means that so far the quiet decisions won. The pauses, the doubts, the moments of discomfort, the people who waited, the people who hesitated, the people who trusted that doing nothing was sometimes the bravest thing to do. This is not a story about heroes. It is a story about restraint, about choosing not to follow an idea all the way to its logical conclusion, about understanding that just because something can be calculated does not mean it should be executed. The math will always be with us. It will continue to grow more powerful, more subtle, more convincing. It will help us solve problems, build technologies, and understand the universe in ways that would have seemed impossible not long ago. And that is a good thing. As long as we remember what it cannot do, it cannot feel fear, it cannot feel responsibility, it cannot imagine absence. Those things belong to us. So perhaps the quiet ending of this story is the right one. No warning sirens, no dramatic conclusions, just a gentle reminder that the world did not end, not because we were perfect, but because we were careful, because we allowed uncertainty to exist, because we did not demand that every question have an immediate answer, and because at the most dangerous moments in human history, someone looked at a number, felt a hesitation, and decided to wait. That decision is easy to miss, but it is the reason you are listening to this at all. So as this story fades out, there is nothing you need to do, nothing to remember, nothing to solve. Just notice the quiet, the calm, the fact that for now, the equations are silent, and the world is still here, which, considering everything, is more than enough.